Now we're going to have a short presentation by Mark. I think you will describe both the accountability mechanism and the role of the inspection panel, and then go a bit into the question of trends in terms of the themes that are coming up. You will get a bit into the question of the climate themes and just transition as issues that are coming before the inspection panel. So we'll hear you on that. I'll kick it off with a couple of questions after that, and then we'll open it up. Yeah? Does that sound okay?
Fantastic, and thanks for inviting me here. Looking forward to the discussion. Yeah, so we're going to spend about maybe 20 minutes just running through a few slides. For those of you who don't know about the inspection panel, just a bit of history, structure. It is the oldest accountability mechanism in the MD space. A little bit about some of the cases that we've been looking at, particular focus on more recent cases. I've been with the panel now for 4 years. I'm in my final year. You're only allowed to work for 5 years for the inspection panel, and in fact for the World Bank Group, and then I'm not allowed to work for the group after that. And then we'll move on to some specifics around climate change, and particularly this sort of term that's coming more into use around just transition. So going right back to the early 80s, the early 90s, how did the inspection panel come about? Well, it was driven by the community. It was driven by particularly a project that wasn't going very well in India. As you can see, a large infrastructure project. In this case, it was a dam and canals to do with water, and over 120,000 people were going to need to be resettled. There were protests and significant pressure put on the bank at that point. And although they had emerging environmental and social standards, there was concern that they weren't really being applied. And people like Professor David Hunter, who's still around today, for those of you who get a chance to go to AU in Washington, DC, great advocates of really trying to get the bank to do something that would hold the bank accountable. So 30 years ago, and we've literally just celebrated our 30-year anniversary, 1993, the inspection panel was set up. And it was very much a community-driven, independent and transparent mechanism. It sort of had a bumpy road a little bit, and there have been sort of frustrations of various times that sometimes requests haven't sort of gone into investigation when perhaps they should have done. But largely now it is a fully functional inspection panel accountability mechanism. We're looking at environmental and social issues, and we report directly to the board of the World Bank. So that's the sort of brief history. Rolling forward to now, what does it look like? Well, at the moment, it is a panel structure. You'll see the 3 panel members, myself. So I'm the sort of European environmental specialist. Ramani Kunagan, she's a Sri Lankan Australian and a social specialist. And Ibrahim Pam, he's the legal specialist, and he comes from Nigeria. So you kind of have both sort of geography and the sort of full coverage of the accountability areas that you would want covered. As I mentioned, it's a non-renewable 5-year term. The chairperson is elected annually. I'm the current chairperson, just taking over from Ramani Kunagan, who's just standing down. And then we also have a small technical team who are fantastic, actually. I mean, they are incredibly knowledgeable, and they are asked to be both top specialists in policy, but in organisation as well, because we go out and we see these projects, we spend time in the communities, and we have to do it. I mean, we get support from the World Bank and the project office, but we have to do it independently. So we can't actually be driven around by the World Bank office. We've got to organise our own cars and things. So they're great organisers, but then they're also very good on the technical side as well. And interesting, I was just hearing you off from Tanzania. I'm just off to Tanzania myself actually at the end of next month on an investigation that I'm running. We report directly to the board, and say we're independent from management, and that's incredibly important. So if a particular project has environmental issues that are raised by the community need to feel that they can raise it in a way that they are not going to sort of suddenly have some sort of bias from management. And there's sort of agency and also sort of equity of scale between the community and the bank. I mean, clearly communities don't normally have a bank of experts on ENS. They don't have a legal team. The bank does. So we've got to sort of step as a sort of even arbiter between them, but also enable the community to be able to communicate their concerns. So that's the setup of the panel. I'm going to get onto the cases in a minute, which is really our bread and butter. That's what we do. Since we started 30 years ago, we've looked at over 150 cases. We investigate 1 or 2 a year. So it's quite a small number that we do investigate, but when we do, things do happen and there are changes are made, certainly at the project level and sometimes further. Sometimes it goes all the way to policies or guidance notes being changed. But that's not directly something we do because we only make findings. So it can come as the bank learns from our reports. But another part of what we do is produce what we call our advisories. You can see that we've produced a number since 2016. You can see we started with the kind of more general subject areas, involuntary resettlement, Indigenous people, environmental assessment, etc. And as we've come up more recently, we focus more on specifics aspects of particular projects. So gender-based violence, that was particularly driven in 2016, 2018 by cases in the DRC and Uganda. If you look at offsets, again, that's all related to 3 cases in Uganda related to the Bujagali hydro project. Land administration, and particularly to do with some of the new areas coming in, things like ecosystem services more recently, and then livelihoods. So we did do a advisory on voluntary resettlement, but we felt there was more to be added by looking at some of the livelihood restoration that has to go on underneath resettlement action plans. We can't just do an advisory on anything. It has to be case driven. So it has to be based on history and what we found through findings. We can include a little bit of sort of best practices from elsewhere, but ultimately the core of it's got to be material that we've learnt during our actual investigation. Which brings me actually really to sort of the second part of what we're going to be sort of talking about. We are starting to get cases related to climate change and particularly adaptation projects, and I'll come on to why that is as we go forward. And I think it's likely that either the next one or the next one after that advisory will be around climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and I'm hoping we'll actually be on this term just transition, which I hope we'll dig into in a bit more in this presentation. So this just gives you a flavour of some of the more recent cases. I mean, they tend to be, a lot of our cases tend to be based on infrastructure projects. They can be road, hydro projects, that sort of type of thing. And you can see geography-wise, we are literally all over, the World Bank and where they do their projects. If you look at the specifics of some of those, they tend to be issues around resettlement. It comes up very, very often. They tend to be around the environmental assessment. When there are Indigenous peoples, that can be a big area of potential investigation. The one that's we've just been, the report is at the board at the moment, Bolivia, that's a lot to do with Indigenous people and a road project that's impacted them. If you look at some of the other areas that are coming up, it is starting to get into areas that are impacted by climate change. And the one I've listed up there specifically, Togo, West Africa Coastal Areas Resilience Investment Project, that's the one that I actually investigated with the team at the panel over the last, year and a half. And we have reported that one to board. There's a management action plan, and it brings up a lot of the issues which I think will come up time and time again as we go forward. So that's really going to be the focus when I talk about the case study. And actually, just while I'm here, that picture actually is a picture of the coast in Togo. I don't know, does anybody know what that's a picture of? Do you know what they're doing? No.
Fishermen? Or
yep, they're fishermen. They're fishermen, and they're actually what they call beach lane or beach lane fishing, which is basically nets that people put out, the community put out, and they put them out between 2 and 5 kilometres in the morning, and then they gradually pull them in. So this is right at the end where they're bringing them together, and then they basically pull them in, and then they gather the fish. It's a very much a community-driven fishing process. And in fact, that was what was impacted by the project. And you were talking about how you bring everybody with you and the just transition. And that's very much what we'll be talking about. Anyway, the pictures there, we'll come back to it in a minute, the specifics of that one. So I thought I'd just include a little bit about the bank. I mean, the inspection man is independent of the bank, so I can't really speak for what the bank is doing, but I can certainly just sort of cover what they are talking about. And there is a big move. AJ Banga, as new president, has come in and said, we really need to be focusing about, global goods and particularly on tackling climate change. He's created a new vision and mission to create a world free of poverty on a livable planet. So slightly moved on from where we were, and he's very much pushing the agenda on both what the bank is doing, how it thinks about it, but also in respect to the amount of money that's going to go in this area. And I think it's up to 2025. 45% of the money will be on climate-related projects, either through IDA or IBRD. So this will be money focused and equally interestingly on climate mitigation projects, and on the other half on adaptation projects. So there's clearly going to be projects being done. And to be fair, I mean, if you think about it, we investigate 1 or 2 projects a year. The bank approves 400 a year, something like that. So we only look at a few. I'm not saying there are perhaps more that go wrong than we don't investigate, but it is, there's a lot of good work going on out there, and a lot of projects go right, and they do a great amount of good. And just to be clear, yes, I just sort of summarise the information I was talking about there. Some pretty significant goals being set about the amount of money going into this area across IBRD and IDA, so that the public sector, and very much across the 2 aspects of it, so climate change mitigation and adaptation. I should draw this myself rather than having to quote the Scottish government, I think. But I found this diagram. I just thought it was a very nice way of thinking about maybe even how we all sort of think about the way that the consideration of climate change and greenhouse gases has evolved. So if you take your initial thinking, it was all about greenhouse gases, and it was all about how we mitigate those gases, how we move from thermal to renewable energy, how we have energy efficiency, etc. And I guess almost seamlessly we move from thinking about greenhouse gases to thinking about climate change. But obviously, if you're thinking about climate change and the impacts of climate change, then you're moving very much into that sort of top impacts around the globe. We're talking about flooding, we're talking about drought, all the sort of the weather impacts that are being changed by climate change. And if you go to Togo, you've got a 3-dimensional problem there. So you've got a beach which is losing 1 to 2 meters on average a year, horizontally, as it were, over 10 meters in some places. But then you've also got sea level rise, which is dramatically affecting them there. So next 100 years, it will be risen by 1 meter. Next 300 years, it will be 3 meters. So this is very much just showing you that as we've moved from greenhouse gases to thinking about mitigation of that to climate change. And I would suggest, and I saw a little bit of this at COP28, that maybe we're now moving to the 1 step further, which is not just about climate change, but it's about a just transition. And I know there are all sorts of definitions out there, and I don't claim to have the right one, as it were. But what I like to think about it is as we move from a high carbon intensity environment to a low carbon intensity environment, we do it in a just way, which means a bit sort of American, and maybe I spent too long in DC recently, but we bring everybody with us, yes. And one of the things that's going to be really important, when I look at the community concerns, it's both environment and social, and very much ensuring that the social elements are properly mitigated and managed as well as you do good things for the environment. And I know maybe that's where we're going to get onto some of the questions in a minute, but I think that's essential. So almost see 3 stages. We move from mitigating climate change, so mitigating greenhouse gases, to climate change and thinking about adaptation projects, to hopefully the next stage, which is actually doing it in a way that is just for everybody. So just thinking about the kind of projects that could come to us. Now, the way that we get complaints, and there's quite a strict criteria, which is one of the reasons why we actually only process a very few, is if you think about it, there are sort of 3 types of projects and concerns that could come to us. There are ones that are to do with thermal energy, so I don't know, gas project or a coal project or something like that. There are ones to do with mitigation, so you could have some kind of renewables, you could have some kind of energy efficiency, and there are ones to do with adaptation, things like coastal protection, coastal resilience projects, things like that. Now, the reality is, from our side of the bank, and it's not quite the same, we were talking a bit earlier about IFC, the private sector part of the bank. From our side of the bank, we're not likely to see that many cases come to us or requests come to us on the greenhouse gas emissions area. And the reason for that is we have to determine whether the complaint is linked to the project and it comes from local people. And the reality is greenhouse gases, the potential harm is as much to me here, because it's a global thing, as it is to local people. So if we do get a request in that area, it's more likely to come at the end of everything else saying there's local pollution and I'm concerned about resettlement. And by the way, there's it has an issue on climate change, rather than it being climate change itself, because it will be difficult and maybe almost a test case actually for us to take one forward, because the harm and serious harm that we have to make the case for to actually take things forward will be difficult to make, being the small, relatively small amount of greenhouses that the plant or whatever it was actually making in that local area. So in reality, we're more likely to get cases around the other 2. So things like the renewable energy, and I don't know if you've ever been to solar plants, but I remember sitting on one in South Africa and just about to be built, and I stand in the corner of near Kimberley in South Africa, and they were going to go. They sat there and they said, you're standing here. The solar plant's going to go 3 kilometres that way and 2 kilometres that way, and then there's a whole lot of people who are using that land, and so all the standard old issues that are coming up to do with resettlement and the huge competition for land are going to come up again in a really big way as we try and compete for that land for mitigation, for solar plants, for wind turbines, that sort of type of thing. And then the other area that was going to come in quite a bit is adaptation projects, because quite a lot of those are infrastructure projects, and that's pretty much what we get most of our requests about. And ensuring that, yes, they might be looking to make some very good, they might be very sensible and logical and actually supported. And in fact, the Togo project was supported locally for what it was trying to do, which was to push back the tide or slow down the erosion. The reality was it was having impacts on the social side, which weren't fully mitigated by the project or even realised by the project. So I thought, just to bring this to life, I would actually take you all the way to Togo, or as much as I possibly could. It is a gloriously sunny place, and having spent hours on the beach talking to the community and spending time there, it is a wonderful place to go to, and it is an incredibly challenging environment to think about from going forward, because it is on this soft sand and it is on an area that is being eroded quite rapidly. You can see me there standing on a road that a few years ago was very usable, clearly isn't now. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a beach that is rapidly eroding, 1 or 2 meters if it's left naturally. If you've got something a bit further to the west, like a port facility, and there's another project that IFC are doing which have had challenges of this, you can have areas which are even more eroded further down east to it. You can go over 10 meters, etc. And then just on this picture, we're just showing you some of the nets that are on the beach and the actual project itself. There are 2 parts of it. One was an emergency structure, which was those, I think you see them, there's these concrete pipes. That's the not in place, but they built up a barrier of concrete pipes. That was a temporary measure. And the others was a series of groins. So that's sort of piles of stone that go out perpendicular to the beach and are designed to slow down the sediment flow from west to east. And there's also some replenishment of sand going in there. Now, if you think about that one, you're probably starting to progress what the problem was. You've got these nets which are 2 to 5 kilometres long, which you put out along the beach, and you've now got these groins coming in here 300 or 400 metres apart. And the reality is it's very difficult to do that beach fishing going forward. And when we looked at the analysis of the fishing, it was really in consideration of boats, which there are there as well, but it wasn't really in consideration of this type of fishing, which was really missed by the project when it considered it in the environmental assessment process. There's another, that's exactly what I was just talking about. So you've got the beach stone fishing, you've got the 2 nets coming in, another picture there, and you've got the groin as well. Simplistically, it really is just a pile of stones that are being out, but you can imagine trying to wheel that net across those stones, both health and safety, but also practicality of nets breaking and that sort of type of thing. So clearly that was going to be disrupted. There was potential for curtailing it and having these shorter nets. When we talked to the project, they thought that was going to be possible. When we talked to the community, they weren't so sure whether that was going to be possible. But clearly it was going to change, and it wasn't going to be this big community activity. And interestingly, if you look on the picture of the people there, you'll see this really is the community. And in fact, at the end of the day, there's a whole hierarchy of how the fish are then processed and go off the market. So there's the formal part to it. And then what is left is then picked up by local families, and even there's children there, and they may pick up a fish, and that may be the only protein they have that week. So there's a whole area of impact which if you lose it, you lose elements that you perhaps wouldn't have even realised. Now this going from the sort of the pictures to the kind of detail, and it's interesting because you might think this is a complicated diagram. We actually sat with an A3 picture of this diagram on that very beach that we were talking about in front of the community with the requesters, trying to explain not only the current project, but trying to give them agency, trying to give them understanding so that they could input sensibly, or not sensibly, input in a way that they could understand the consequences of when they had to input the next consultation and develop what we call the map or the management action plan in relation to this project. And what we were trying to do is introduce them to the concept of adaptation pathways. And what we're saying here is, you live on the beach here. Yes, there's a coastal resilience project being put in, but the reality is that's a 15-year, 20-year, 30-year project, and then it's going to have to come back and do something else because there's some other things going on here. The sea is rising, a metre in 100 years. The beach is eroding, and whilst the mitigation measures that are being put in with these groins will slow it down, it won't stop it. And so, in reality, the next 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, it's going to change quite a bit in here, and depending on what adaptation pathway you take, it will change your thinking, how you want to live here. Do you want to actually think about, maybe if I'm not going to live here in 50 years, maybe I should, move now, sort of type thing. So, just trying to get an understanding of the situation, nothing to do with what the project, but just giving them agency to be able to input as they went going forward. Now, we had the remit to do this because we do this process after we've written our inspection report. We go straight out again to the community and prepare them to input to the management action plan. And the management action plan was going to be putting the project back into policy to ensure it met with the environmental and social standards of the bank. And to enable them to do that, we needed them to understand, when they did the consultation with the bank, what were the consequences or what were the issues when they inputted to that. And so they had that, and it enabled them to have some agency to actually do that. And that's actually my 2 colleagues there. I think I took that picture, on the beach, and they haven't got that diagram there. I think that one's actually about shown in the community about sediment flow, actually. Now, a couple of points here. clearly this isn't a PowerPoint presentation. If you were listening to that, this isn't in English and this isn't in French. This is in Awe. So you've got sometimes double translation. Something my two colleagues speak French. I don't, so they can speak French, but our translators spoke all three. So it's in a language that the community can understand. It's diagrams that we could spend time talking to. It's Q&A there. We went back to the community and we talked. We did it in 2 sessions. So we did one session where we gave a feedback of what the findings of the actual report did. We gave them time to think about it, and then we came back in a couple of days, and we actually then did a Q&A and did any questions they wanted to ask. And that enabled them in the couple of weeks after that to be able to input to that management action plan. And I come back to, and I put the vision back on there of the bank to create a world free of poverty on a livable planet. And to me, and this is absolutely my view, this isn't the bank view, but the pathway of doing that is ultimately, I think, is a just transition, because the issue said we want world free of poverty. That's been with the bank forever. But we want to do it on a livable planet. So that's the part about we want to transition to this livable planet. And the way to do that, to make it all work and to actually be fair, is for it to be a just transition. So I'm going to pause there. I think that was my last slide. I know I've covered quite a bit, but very much open to questions and answers.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Mark. I found this super interesting because it brings really home the reality of these concepts that we're all working with, adaptation and just transition in a very tangible way. So I found that really very interesting. I don't know. I have a couple of questions that I wanted to ask to sort of kick it off, perhaps, but everybody should then feel free to come in. So one question for me is sort of about the very basis of what the inspection panel does. So there are, you can complain if you are affected as a community by a project that the World Bank is financing. But how far can you stretch that concept? You kind of touched a bit on it with the greenhouse gas emissions. We have these lawsuits, right? Some kids in Wyoming, I think. You have the Peruvian farmer who are kind of, complaining successfully that essentially not enough is being done to preserve their future. If we take the World Bank by its commitment, is the commitment something that might conceivably be something that can be complained about? So to say the World Bank isn't, could a community complain that the bank isn't doing enough with its projects, that it's not being effective enough, not just about the being affected as a community in a certain way. I know I'm stretching this terribly far. And connected to that, for me, the financial commitment that the bank is now making, so 35% now up to 45% of its financing, is good. But it's we've all kind of studied what this actually means, and much of that isn't not necessarily very effective climate work. The CGD study perhaps that looked at that. You have others who have said that this is a bit of a smokescreen around some of these numbers. What about outcome-based objectives? And that, again, linking to what the inspection panel might be doing in the future.
Okay, so the first one was around, what can we cover? It's actually very strict what we can cover. And there's a reality there is we only look at a very small number of cases because, first of all, they shouldn't go wrong. And then secondly, if they have gone wrong from an environmental and social perspective, there should be something at the project level. There should be a grievance redress mechanism at that level. And then secondly, there's at the bank, there's a grievance redress system, which again deals with at a level up issues that people should be able to, that can complain about, and that should be solved there. So it's only really after that, in fact, part of our criteria is they have to have touched in with the bank before they actually can come to us, and the requests will be processed. So the reality is, from that dimension, we only look at a small number of complaints. Well, we look at a number of them, but we can only process a small number. And then secondly, on the dimension of the criteria, we can't look at issues that aren't specifically related to the environmental and social policies of the bank. So we're not looking at impact. There are other bits of the bank which are looking at the impact of it. But and interestingly, up to this point, we've only been looking, and remember, we're on the public part of the bank, not the private part. We've only been looking up at the safeguards, because we can only look at the policies that were when the bank actually approved the project. So even though the bank has moved to, and you may have come across this, the environmental and social framework, that's been going for 5 years. It has more defined standards. They look very much more similar to the IC performance standards, actually. And although new projects have been applied to that, the reality is all the projects that we've had, they were approved before then, and therefore we're going to the safeguard. So it is quite narrow. So I think the answer, very simplistically, your first point is no, that we're not the facility for that. But what we are the facility for is environmental and social issues against the policy, to the safeguards. And when we do look into those areas and they come up, they do go to the various highest part of the bank. And it's probably worth just actually thinking about, how does that change, or what does it do? And it does two things. The first is to try and start the process of remedy for the community, because there's some kind of harm that's happened there, or harm that's going to happen in the future. But the second is to have the learning of the bank, the institutional learning as we move forward, and ultimately the bank's being held accountable from that perspective. And if I think of our cases, there are times when the project is brought back into policy. So that might be something like Togo. There was another case up there which was India rural water. Now that was across 4 states in India. And the reality there was it was to do with water treatment and elevated reservoirs. And the reality there was that the project saw that although the issues were just specifically in this one small subcomponent in one of the states, when they looked at them, there were systematic errors or problems across all 4 states, and each of these states is the size of a country. So this is pretty major. And if you look at what the bank then did, it then upgraded its environmental management plan, its environmental statements. I think over 300 environmental management plans were improved. I think nearly 1,000 environmental statements were updated. So that had quite a big impact on that. And then you come back to cases like the GBV cases in 2016 and 2018 in Uganda and DRC, where again, we didn't make recommendations, we made findings, but ultimately guidance changed in the bank, and guidance changed in things like influx management. So when big contractors come into communities, how they behave in communities, how they interact, codes of conduct, guidance was put in place. So things actually changed from the way the whole of the bank operates when that particular issue comes out. And then there's one final, the really big area, and it's impossible for us to tell how much influence we have on this. But if you think about it, the kind of issues that come up, things like involuntary settlement, consultation, and if you think of the improvements are made when the iteration of standards changes, so for instance, when the ESF came out, the Environmental Social Framework, there have definitely been improvements and more detail and more refinement in those. Now, we're not claiming any particular aspect of it, but clearly the findings that we had related to those issues and would have been all part of contributing to improvement in those standards. So I think in some ways, we're a little bit limited, coming back to your original question. We can't just accept something in general on impact or something like that. But where we do things and where it comes out with a major new issue, it does almost by osmosis lead to a change in the way the bank operates going forward. So that's that question. Your second one was on, was your second?
Well, it was actually going beyond the inspection panel, but the question of whether the objectives shouldn't be framed around outcomes rather than the finance.
So this is where I absolutely can't speak for the bank. I mean, clearly, one of the things you need to do if you're a bank is set a goal on the money first, because otherwise it will definitely not happen. And I hope in a lot of ways the kind of work that the inspection panel is doing will, we have a case on adaptation. There are some interesting concepts that have come up there, and I'll just talk about a couple of them that have come up. If you think about the environmental assessment, normally you do an environmental assessment and you do it on a 20, 30-year scale of the project. But if you've got climate change coming in here and you're thinking about adaptation pathways, really your environmental assessment where you do your consultation needs to be thinking about 50, 100 years, 150 years, and have that input into that consultation process. So I would like to see that come out more, environmental assessment. I think that environmental assessment, that dimension's got to change. So I think that kind of thing will change. Another thing that's come up, I mean, again, an interesting concept, maybe even a new term here, we effectively had a moving baseline. So if you think about, I mean, there was a small resettlement action plan developed for an area here. If you think about how long that takes, that may take, I don't know, from when you were thinking about developing the resettlement action plan to actually implementing it, and certainly when the project starts, maybe, I don't know, 2 years. But if you've got, 2, 5 meters, whatever it is, the beach going in at that time, the actual area you're talking about is going to change. And so there's a kind of moving baseline just because the natural processes that are happening at that point. So again, that's going to need to be taken into consideration. So I think there are elements of impact that are going to come from us, but as I say, I can't speak for the bank about how they should focus it. I mean, I think the first off is to say you're going to put a whole pile of money in. I've worked in the private sector. I know in a way, if you have no money, you absolutely can't make it happen. So put it that way. But then you have to define how you do it in the right way. And you mentioned at the beginning, I worked for CDC, what is now BII, and then I worked in emerging markets for over 10 years, and Director of Responsible Investment. And that was very much how we saw it. We saw it as, yes, there's making money because that's what we're being asked to do by our limited partners as a fund, but we're doing it with these environmental and social controls, and ultimately then some of the things we're being put on there was impact as well.